In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Gary Taubes. Gary is an investigative science and health journalist and the co-founder of the not-for-profit Nutrition Science Initiative. He is the author of The Case Against Sugar, a book with a subtitle, Why We Get Fat and What We Can Do About It. He's also the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, which in the UK was published under the title The Diet Delusion. Gary has won so many awards and accolades for his research and his writing, including the International Health Reporting Award from the Pan American Health Organization and the National Association of Science Writers Award, which he has won in 1996, 1999 and 2001. He is to date the only print journalist to have won the award 3 times. I'm joined today with Gary Taubes, who I have to say was the first book I read when I was obese. My personal trainer said, Steve, you're doing everything wrong. He gave me a book called Good Calories, Bad Calories. And I said to my personal trainer, no, this is rubbish. A calorie is just a calorie. And I read it and it transformed my life. Hopefully I'll be around longer now to see my 7 children grow up. Gary, first of all, a massive thank you for writing your first book.
My pleasure. Always happy to help.
Yeah, absolutely, totally inspiring, and just explained so much to me I didn't know. But for those in Great Britain that maybe haven't come across your brilliant works before, tell us your story. Take as much time as you want, because I think it's the story that will set the scene for the advice we might give during the hour.
Okay, so we should say that first book is called The Diet Delusion in the UK. So if you want to read it, that's the one to go for. I was an investigative science journalist, so I have a hard science background. In the mid-'80s, I became an investigative journalist when I had the opportunity to be embedded with some physicists at the huge physics laboratory outside of Geneva, CERN, and watch them discover what turned out to be non-existent fundamental particles. So in effect, I was living with them, expecting a great breakthrough as they were, and they screwed up and made mistakes, and I ended up chronicling how they realized they had made these mistakes. And I became obsessed with how easy it is to do bad science and how hard it is to do science right. I did a second book on the same subject. I did a series of investigations for the journal Science and the science magazine Discover. And in the mid-'90s, my friends in the physics community, of whom I had quite a few, said, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at the stuff in public health. It's terrible. And it simply wasn't up to their standards of what's required to learn something meaningful and reliable about the universe. So by the late 90s, I had moved into diet, the question of whether salt causes high blood pressure. I did an investigation for the journal Science. It took me 9 months. I interviewed about 80-odd researchers and administrators who had been involved with this story, all for one magazine article. And it turned out that this sort of bedrock belief that we should eat low-salt diets to keep our blood pressure down was based on excruciatingly little compelling evidence. If this was a criminal trial, you would acquit salt. That's the way to think about it. And you would acquit it effortlessly. I mean, it wouldn't take 3 days of deliberations. A jury would meet. They would say, there's no evidence here, and you'd acquit it. I moved from salt to dietary fat, from dietary fat to obesity, and found pretty much the same story everywhere we went. Public health authorities and researchers were so concerned that people were dying from, obesity and heart disease and hypertension, and they were worried about the obesity epidemic, and they had certain preconceived beliefs. And they just embraced these beliefs without really doing the kind of rigorous science necessary to test them. And my books, the book you read, which is The Good Calories, Bad Calories here, and The Diet Delusion in the UK, is a kind of extensive investigation of all these belief systems. It's a work of journalism, it's not a diet book, even though it kind of sounds like a diet book. And the conclusion is, it's almost a joke. Much of what we've been taught is simply not true. And while I was doing this, it turned out to be kind of an alternative stream of research that made an enormous amount of sense, that had a lot more evidence to back it up, and that's held up to testing over time. And that's this idea that instead of avoiding dietary fat and salt, we should be avoiding the carbohydrate, easily digested carbs in our diet and sugars, and they're the cause of most of these chronic diseases we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that what made your book so amazing is that, there's a lot of people write diet books, and there's some really, really good ones out there. But certainly for people with a brain like mine, and my background is a businessman, is that I needed a book that explained why everything I'd been taught was actually incorrect. I needed not so much to know the ins and outs about the human body and the diet, but I needed to understand that journey of where it all went wrong to realize that actually, yeah, I have been sort of fed a pack of lies. And like I say, your book was amazing. Then Nina's came out, and the whole story from Ansel Keys right up, through misrepresentation, bad science for so many years. But it was really, really a fabulous book. So on that journey as an investigative scientist, tell me some of the lessons you learned. You mentioned a minute ago that salt probably has got a bad rap as being the villain when probably it shouldn't have been. What have you learned about sort of fat and sugars, and what can we help the listener that's watching that maybe wants to lose some weight or is worried about chronic diseases or metabolic syndrome? What sort of advice can we give?
Okay, so a lot of questions in there. There's two, excuse me, nutrition policy is, our thinking on nutrition is on more or less three fundamental pillars since the 1960s when we started to go off the rails. So one is this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. So dietary fat raises our cholesterol, and then specifically saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, and that causes atherosclerosis, heart disease. We die prematurely. That's gone through sort of evolved over the years, but that's the basic idea. And everything else we believed in nutrition had to kind of agree with that, because that was considered the great triumph of the early 1960s to 1980s. Second idea is we should be eating mostly plant diets. So this is then fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes are an essential part of a healthy diet. And this comes out of the field of epidemiology. And basically, when you look at what healthy people eat and you compare them to what unhealthy people eat, one of the things that healthy people tend to do is eat fruits, vegetables, whole grains. So we look at what healthy people do and we say this is what we should all do. And the third thing, the absolute bedrock belief system in all this is we get fat because we eat too much. So that's the biblical terms are gluttony and sloth. The technical terminology is that obesity is an energy balance disorder, and it's caused by an intake of calories greater than our expenditure. I mean, there's a lot of ways that scientists phrase this idea to make it sound scientific. And I believe this. It seemed obvious, right? Eat too much. Sure. The word obesity, as I recently learned reading the memoirs of a journalist named Roxane Gay, the word obesity comes from the Latin obesus, which means to have eaten until fat. And everything kind of depends on this. So the whole idea that the amount of calories we consume is sort of fundamental to all of nutrition thinking. And if we consume too much, we get fat. And what I learned doing my research is that this is absurd. And it's one of these ideas that's as though I told you, and when you say this to researchers, they're saying, well, you're denying the laws of thermodynamics, you're denying the laws of physics, which is basically their misunderstanding of what the laws of physics tell you. This idea that we get fat because we eat too much is or that we take in more calories than we expend is like saying we get rich because we make more money than we spend. Or a restaurant gets crowded because more people enter than leave. I don't know, a kid gets taller because he takes in more energy than he. There's all these very obvious metaphors that are logically equivalent. If somebody gets fatter, they have to take in more energy than they expend. That's sort of what the laws of physics tell you, because they can't just create energy out of whole cloth in their bodies, so more has to enter than leave. But it says nothing about why they get fat. And what I learned doing my research is up until World War II, when the best medical science was being done in Europe and Germany and Austria particularly, these clinical investigators there had concluded that obesity had to be a hormonal disorder. You know, there's a famous line from a George Bernard Shaw play, Misalliance, where his character Tarleton says, you know, some people just put on weight no matter how much they eat. It's constitutional. There's no fighting it. And this was always seen as this sort of lame excuse that obese people with obesity had to avoid eating in moderation and exercising like lean people do. But the reality is it's true. You know, that was what these Germans and Austrians were arguing, that obesity had to be. We know that all aspects of fat accumulation are regulated by hormones, like men and women fatten differently. You know, men get fat above the waist, women get fat below the waist. When we go through puberty, men lose fat and gain muscle, women gain fat and do it in very specific places. So, you know, it seemed clear that excess fat was just some kind of dysregulation of these hormones that regulated where and how we store fat. And this hadn't been worked out carefully yet. We didn't have the tools to do it. And when we burn fat for fuel and when we don't. And so I learned all this doing my research for the Diet Delusion. And what I learned is by the 1960s, when researchers, the field is known as endocrinology, the study of hormones and hormone-related diseases. That field couldn't come of age until you had a technology to measure hormones in the bloodstream, and that happened in the 1960s. And very quickly, the researchers involved learned that that fat accumulation was regulated primarily by the hormone insulin. So if you think about it, obesity and type 2 diabetes are very closely associated. If you're overweight or obese, it's highly likely that you've got dysregulated blood sugar and you're going to become diabetic. And if you're a type 2 diabetic, it's very likely that you're going to be obese. And now these researchers tied the same hormone dysfunction to both diseases, insulin dysregulation. And we secrete insulin to the carbohydrates in our diet, primarily. So you can think of carbohydrates regulating our insulin secretion and insulin regulating our fat accumulation. And by the 1960s, there was this beautiful story that was also tied into the conventional wisdom up until then, which is that carbohydrates are fattening. Like my mother's generation grew up believing that, you know, bread, pasta, potatoes, sweets, beer were all these like inherently fattening foods. And if you didn't want to be fat, you didn't eat them. But in the 1960s, the brilliant researchers doing nutrition in the US started to believe that dietary fat caused heart disease. So if you're going to tell people not to eat fat, they have to replace those calories. So the carbohydrate went from being something that every woman knew was fattening to a heart-healthy diet food over the course of 20 years. And by 1980s, leading influencers in the world were telling people they had to eat carbs, coincident with the world getting fatter with these obesity epidemics. So the fundamental message of my book, and that's just one stream of research, and there were multiple streams that led into this idea that easily digestible carbs, so, you know, refined grains and breads and sweets, pastries, and starchy carbs like potatoes are fattening. And if people don't want to be fat, they can't eat them. And the worst is sugar, for other reasons that took 20 to 30 years to begin to understand. And we still haven't worked out the details. And like I said, in my research, where I went back historically, because I think if you can understand how we made a mistake, you have to understand how we got there. If you can understand whether we made a mistake, you have to understand how we got there. Sure. You know, you go back 200 years and people are saying that, I mean, very influential physicians and writers about food are saying if you don't want to be fat, you can't eat carbs. You got to avoid beer like the plague, and sugar makes everything worse.
Yeah, there was a gentleman in England, wasn't there, Banting, who became overweight, and Banting even in the late 1800s said that, you know, he reversed his own obesity by just cutting out the starchy foods and the sugars and the beers.
Yeah. But even before Banting, 40 years before Banting, is this Frenchman, Jean-Antoine Briat-Savarin. He wrote the single most famous book about food. It's called The Physiology of Taste. It's been in print for almost 200 years. Another 6 years, it'll be 200 years his book has stayed in print. Wow. And he said the same thing. He said he was a lawyer and a bon vivant who decided he was going to write about food and study food, and he worked on this book for 25 years. And he says at the end in the book, I've studied 500 people. I've had conversations with 500 people who suffer with obesity, and they're always telling me the foods they can't live without are potatoes or bread or rice, and he says, I've struggled with obesity myself because he likes nothing more than to eat. And the way to win out over it, avoid starches, grains, and sugars. And this is 1825.
Wow. So
one line I quote in all of my books, including my next one, is the first sentence of a 1963 British Journal of Nutrition article that's written by one of the two leading, British dietitians. And the first sentence is, every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge that no nutritionist would dispute. And that's what and then by the 1980s, it's Jane Brody, who's the leading nutrition writer at the New York Times, and in that period had just unparalleled influence in communicating the nutrition science. Writes a book called The Good Food Book. It's a massive bestseller, and the subtitle is Living the High Carb Life.
Can you
we used to tell people not to eat carbs.
Yeah, Gary, you just broke up then. You just broke up when you were saying the journalist wrote a book. And can you just repeat that one because we broke up a bit?
The book is called The Good Food Book. It's a massive bestseller, and the subtitle was Living the High Carb Life. I don't remember it exactly, but that's pretty close to it. And she says in the book, we used to tell people if you didn't want to get fat, don't eat pasta, bread, potatoes. But now we know these are heart healthy diet foods, and these are the foods you should be eating. Oh. And then during this period, because we're so focused on eating fat or avoiding fat, so all the public health guidelines are basically saying dietary fat's going to kill you, saturated fat's going to kill you, that sugar effectively gets a free pass. They never say eat as much as you want. They say avoid eating too much. But that's the worst they say about it. I could tell you to avoid doing too much of anything. Avoid jumping up and down on your bed too much. You'll break the springs. It's a kind of meaningless advice. And the sugar science, people are pushing the sugar science, particularly John Yudkin, the British nutritionist, the most influential nutritionist in Europe, are being portrayed as quacks because they think sugar is like, how dare they think sugar is bad for you? This is God's gift to us as human beings to find pleasure without alcohol, nicotine, or caffeine.
Fascinating. I wrote something once. I might have stolen it from you actually, and I said the problem by saying all calories are equal, it's like saying that the British pound, the American dollar, and the euro, 100 of each, is the same thing. They all are 100. They're all a currency, but what they afford you are totally different things. So getting your food, your calories from fat, or from protein, or from carbohydrates are all totally different things. Now, I know you've just flown back. I know you've just flown back in from Israel at a conference. What is the? And as an investigative scientist, you're always looking for the next thing. And you mentioned you have a new book. What's the latest learning that's going around in the circle?
Well, I'm actually not looking for the next thing. I mean, I would like to move on to nutrition because again, all my books, I've now written 3 on nutrition and 1 on physics and 1 on nuclear chemistry or nuclear physics, and they're all about good science and bad science. This is what obsesses me. This is where my real intellectual, I've benefited from the nutrition work clearly, and a lot of other people have as well. It's funny, my favorite reviews of the Diet Delusion are people will say, This is the worst diet book I've ever read, and they'll give it 1 star on Amazon. It's a 450-page book, with the history of various strains of the science and the philosophy of science wrapped in. But I'm still trying to get these points across. We have these obesity and diabetes epidemics are overwhelming our healthcare systems. The burden to the individuals are just terrible, and they're getting the wrong advice, and the doctors are giving them the wrong advice, and this has to be fixed. There's no escaping it. So, and the people who end up buying into it are people like ourselves who we look at the research or we read the books that others read and we say, this is interesting, let's see what happens. And we change our diets and we get healthier. And now we think we just did the exact opposite of what we're told to do. And we're lighter, we're leaner, we're healthier, we have more energy. A lot of other health problems tend to go away with, like if you're hypertensive, the evidence is pretty compelling that if you give up carbs, if you eat a ketogenic diet or a low-carb, high-fat diet or Atkins, whatever you want to call it, your blood pressure will come down significantly. So people get healthier. I'm still interested in getting that message across. I'm always interested in how to change the argument. So even this issue of a calorie is a calorie, I'm keep thinking it's not so much that the euro and the pound and the Israeli shekels are 100 of each have different monetary values. It's imagine if you're using them, for instance, like if I hit you over the head with them. So I have $100 and $100 bill, US dollars, and I hit you over the head, and I have $100 worth of British pounds in coins, and I hit you over the head with it, and I have $100 in gold, and I hit you over the head with it. It's going to have entirely different effects on your head, even though it's all worth $100. Because what we're interested in is
that is a better analogy than mine.
Yeah, and I just came up with that at the moment because again, I can hit you over the head with $500 bills, and it's still not going to hurt as much as $100 worth of gold or $100 worth of British pounds. It's not going to do as much damage to your head because these are fundamentally different forces at work. So it's been ignored here, where then the nutrition community repeats this mantra: calorie is a calorie is a calorie. And it's got all kinds of implications that go way down into how they think. But each of these macronutrients, fat, carbohydrates, and proteins, influences your body in a very different way. Your body secretes different levels of hormones and even entirely different hormones to each of these nutrients. So if you eat fat, butter, or olive oil, you don't secrete any insulin. If you eat carbohydrates, you secrete a lot of insulin and very little else. If you eat protein, you secrete insulin and then the hormone glucagon, which is secreted by the pancreas also, and then growth hormone. And the glucagon and the growth hormone kind of direct the nutrients from the protein to being used to rebuild muscles and regenerate cells, and because that's what we need it for. Whereas the insulin tells your body to burn carbohydrates and store fat. If you eat the fat alone, you can store it without insulin. So you get entirely different hormonal signals. The pompous term to use is the hormonal milieus that affect whether you store these calories or you burn these calories for fuel or you use them to rebuild cells and muscles and tissues. And, the message is always the same. Regarding Israel and what's happening, so when I started this research 20 years ago, I'd say there were maybe a dozen physicians in the world prescribing these low-carb, high-fat diets. The technical term is ketogenic diets. For a long time, they've been known as low-carb diets. For a while, they were known as high-protein diets. The terms keep changing, but the gist of it is you don't eat carbs because they're fattening. So you avoid the bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, the grains, the legumes, all fattening. And you eat a lot of fat and green vegetables, green leafy vegetables, because while they have carbs in them, the fiber and water content kind of dilutes all that out to the point that they're harmless. So a dozen physicians 20 years ago, half of those had written books. So you got people like Atkins and Mike and Mary Dan Eads, who had written Protein Power, and the guys who had written Sugar Busters, and Dukan and France. And today, because of the work of some researchers who started doing this research when it was very much out of fashion, usually because they had a patient who, against their specific instructions, went on Atkins and lost a lot of weight and got healthier and had their cholesterol profiles improve. So these researchers get involved, people like Eric Westman and David Ludwig at Harvard and Jeff Folek and then at Connecticut, and Steve Finney at UC Davis, and they start doing research. And then when I come into the picture in 2002, I've got those researchers, not just to interview and talk about their research, but to tell me that just because the conventional wisdom, most scientists believe fat is the problem and we get fat because we eat too much, that doesn't mean it's true. I'd been hearing this from the physicists for decades, and I was properly, indoctrinated to believe that message. And then because journalists like me and Nina and Tim Noakes and then other physicians start reading our work and our articles, and suddenly today, 2019, I estimate maybe 10 or 20,000 physicians worldwide who have bought into this logic that the problem with modern diets isn't the fat content, it's the carb content. And if they want their patients, so these physicians they tend to cluster in fields like family medicine and internal medicine. And what they see are obesity and diabetes in their patient population. Every year that goes by, they see more and more obesity and diabetes, and they see the negative effects of those diseases, which include hypertension and a whole host of other problems. And they want to make those patients healthy. They didn't go into medical school to manage disease. They didn't become doctors to manage disease. They became doctors because they wanted to make people healthy. And they realized that this is a way to do it. So they try it on themselves. They find out it works. They try it on their patients. If it works on their patients, they're now... So you've got maybe 20,000 people. And while this is happening, you've got these conferences sort of emerging around the world, and they're usually led by one or a few physicians who have bought into this, and they see how much healthier their patients are, and they want that message to get out in their country or their area of the country. So now you have things like this low carb meeting in Israel. There's one in Singapore. There's 3 or 4 in the United States every year. There's one hosted by a British group. Tim Noakes had one in South Africa a few years ago, and the idea is to let the physicians present and let some of the sort of more influential researchers who have the longer time stream, and the journalists like myself and Nina who have the big picture, and let us explain to the people in these countries, this is what's happening. Take it serious.
So, I get it. I was obese. I really didn't think I'd get to 70 years old. I've got 7 children. I've got a great reason to want to live longer. I was doing all the things I thought were right at the time, told were right, eating low fat, exercising like crazy, but I was obese. And I feel cheated. I feel angry. I feel furious. And now today, sort of 4 years later, 5 years later, read your books, and like you say, 20-odd thousand people, doctors, physicians, scientists going, this is wrong. How long before things change in the government in America? And the reason I ask the question is, sadly, in the UK, we just seem to cut and paste, carbon copy what you do in America. And I think the advice we've got in the UK, what we call our eat well plate, is killing people. I won't beat around the bush, but we copy really what happens in America with your food pyramid, with so much force now and science saying that it's not fat that's the problem, it's not salt that's the problem. How long before you think maybe your government will take notice?
That's a very good question. I don't know that's the $64 billion question. There are a lot of forces acting against us. So there's 50, 60 years of bad science, and all those there's a famous saying in science, I think Maxwell, science progresses funeral by funeral. So the idea is the older generation dies off and the younger generation grows up with a new belief. But one of the problems here is that the older generation were just bad scientists. They didn't know how to do really rigorous critical scientists or to think critically and skeptically about their beliefs. And they conveyed that belief system, that bad science, technical term is pathological science, to the younger generation. So we're always fighting their science, and there's no way in the system that the scientists can say at this point, wait, let's stop, we made a mistake. It's virtually impossible, and if they want to do that, they're going to be associated with people like me. They're going to look like quacks. The funding system is going to pass them by. The quickest way to be marginalized in this field is to say, look, stop, we've made a mistake. And in fact, I know some very good scientists who believe exactly like I do, and they won't say that because they want to be able to influence the system as slow as it takes. You've got the food industry. So the food industry, for the most part, produces carbohydrate-rich products. You've got the middle aisles of the supermarkets with the cereals and the sodas and the beers and those are the carb-rich aisles. And you've got people, all the nutrition gurus tend to be saying avoid those, packaged foods, but those are very powerful lobbies, and they're very powerful industries. They employ an enormous amount of people. You want the industry itself to stay healthy. But then there are people like me saying, don't eat the products, they're fattening. And then you've got the environmental movement. And the environmental movement now is, so the easiest way to eat a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet is with animal products. Because animal products are made primarily with the exception of milk and dairy products, they're made of protein and fat. We're not made of carb. We have tiny carbohydrate content in our bodies, and that's true of all animals. So if you want to eat primarily protein and fat, the easiest way to do it is eating animals. There's a large vegetarian vegan movement that's driven by ethical concerns about the treatment of animals and whether we even have the right to raise them and eat them for our benefits. And they're very important philosophical questions and ethical questions they're asking. And then you've got the environmental movement saying livestock agriculture is a significant, contributes a disproportionate amount to climate change through greenhouse gases, and we shouldn't be eating animals for that reason. So you've got a whole world of people who are overweight, obese, diabetic, people like we used to be, who would be healthiest if they ate animal product rich, low carb, high fat diets. And again, it's very easy. If you want to give people advice, say, look, don't eat bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, beans, legumes, any of those carby foods. Just eat, you could have eggs and bacon for breakfast. No, it's not going to kill you. And you can have, meat, fish, or fowl with green vegetables or a salad for lunch and dinner, and your snacks, nuts. I mean, that's an easy advice. It's easy to do. Most people actually like it a lot, especially men. Tell men to have eggs and bacon for breakfast and steak 3 times a day or twice a day. They'll be good if they don't think it's going to kill them. So you've got all these sort of significant forces working against what we're saying is just the best medical advice you could get.
It's interesting talking about the vegans and the vegetarians. Both Robert Lustig, who I'm sure you're aware of, Dr. Robert Lustig, and then in the UK we have a gentleman called Patrick Holden who ran the Soil Association for 20 years, where we stamp things organic. Both of those actually have a counter argument for global warming and the effect that cattle have on it, based on slightly different angles, but both of them can actually say that if the meat that you eat is organic and grass-fed, there's actually it's part of the solution and not the problem. It only becomes a problem when we're raising cattle on corn, and that corn then has been, in fields with fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, and so on. So my statement to vegans and vegetarians is, look, if you're doing it because you love animals and you don't think it's ethical, great, carry on, but probably you might need to supplement because you're not getting the nutrition you need. But if you're doing it for planet reasons, you're wrong. If you're doing it for health reasons, you're wrong. But
well, and I agree.
That's probably not today's conversation, but
yeah, no, and I agree with you. It's just I would like to believe that the environmental argument is true, but I'm fundamentally, I still think of myself fundamentally as an investigative journalist, and so I have to remain fundamentally skeptical, particularly of the beliefs that are convenient for me. So they could be true, and we need more research. What scares me is you get this polarization in the research community. A lot of the early research on the climate cost of livestock agriculture came from researchers in the World Health community and the food and agriculture community who are vegetarians for ethical reasons. And then the vegetarians...
We saw that only this year, didn't we, with the Eat Lancet report? 37 journalists, most of them vegetarians, a lot of them vegetarian, vegan activists. And what Patrick Holden said to me was, Steve, why wasn't there at least one farmer on that panel? Give me a couple of farmers on that panel, and we might have something a bit more balanced.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with you. So clearly it needs clarification. And I try to, I live out in Northern California. I live in Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco. The animals that I end up eating have better lives than I do until the moment that life ends. I try to minimize my climate change footprint and even to balance out my meat consumption if they're right. A lot of people don't have those options.
Sure.
So, and again, what scares me, and I feel the same way about the people who choose, I admire people who choose to become vegans and vegetarians, but they often do it thinking this is the healthiest way to eat because that's what they're being told by those influential researchers, and I don't believe that's true. And as you pointed out, it's very hard to do a nutrient-complete vegan diet. It takes thought and work, and supplements are probably necessary. I worry about children being raised on vegan diets and the damage that can be done, although clearly you can get, exquisitely healthy children doing it, but it takes a lot of thought and a lot of care and a lot of concern that many people don't have or aren't capable of giving. So there are a lot of issues here. My main concern is what's best for health, because I don't want people supporting their arguments as the Eat Lancet group did. This is the best for the environment and it's the best for health. Therefore, we can do this when those two things may not be in alignment. Even if it is the best for the environment, I'm pretty confident it's not the best diet for health, or at least not for the large proportion of the population, which is probably over 50% in the UK, as it's over 50% in the US, who need to eat these, need to avoid carbs, not animals, if they want to be healthy.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good point. So I have a problem. My kids think I'm a nutritional addict, and what does Dad know about health? He's just a businessman who goes and speaks to all these really, really clever people. What is the advice you give to the younger generation on, if you take out all of the bad science over the years, if you take out all the influencers, and I mean, you've done so much research over the 20 years, you must have sold millions of copies of books now. What's the takeaway from all the research on how to live healthier for longer?
Stay away from sugar. That's lesson number one, and particularly sugary beverages. And you might want to stay away from beer too, but I don't want to ruin childhood too much or adolescence. So that's it. I mean, sugar and sugary beverages, white flour, easily digestible grains. Again, the healthier you are and the leaner you are when you're young, the more you can tolerate these foods. So I think if somebody wants to stay lean and healthy their whole life, they start off by getting rid of sugar and refined grains, highly processed grains, and that'll get rid of a lot of the non-technical term crap that they might be tempted to buy in the supermarket and the convenience stores. And then if they're one of these people like myself are predisposed to get heavy, and means they're on their way on this sort of spectrum, on their way to diabetes, then you want to cut back on the carbs significantly and replace it with fat. So these aren't high protein diets. You're not eating lean chicken breasts. I think the lean chicken breast is a culinary abomination and bad for the health also. You're eating, fatty foods and chicken with the skin attached, and the fatty fish and green vegetables, and you just in general staying away from starches and breads and sweets. I mean, it's simple. It's crazy simple.
Isn't that the frightening thing? It is crazy simple. I mean, I was obese. I was 31% body fat. At the year, I walked to the North Pole, which meant I'd trained for like 18 months, day in, night. I mean, I was training like crazy, and yet I got back, and within a week, my doctor said, you're obese, and it's frightening because it is crazy simple when you take away all the crap advice. But when that advice is there and the government are peddling it and the doctors are peddling, my dad's diabetic type 2, still being told by his out-of-date doctor to just cut down on everything and eat a balanced diet. It's just... Now,
why is he's listening to your doctor still, not you?
I know, isn't that frightening?
It's just the way it is. I often wonder. I think it's the hardest people ever to convince are our parents, because they always see us as their children.
Yeah, I wrote in an article, it's one thing bringing up your children, it's harder bringing up your parents.
Yeah, well, they're going to have the same problem with you. So, it goes. And of course, they're going to be conditioned to believe that by the time they're adults, there's going to be a different story. That's the other thing that fights against this is last week. So, it's funny, when one of the arguments against my books is that they're too simplified. So, we used to think fat was a problem. Now we don't. Now Taubes is saying sugar and carbs are the problem, and that's probably wrong too. It's not simple. And I want to say, well, first of all, the reason we don't think fat is a problem because of my investigative reporting. So I have to get credit for that. Maybe I've done something and studied something that other people haven't done or studied. So I have a body of knowledge to inform this. And if you think of it like a criminal case, if you indict the wrong suspect for a murder or a series of murders, it doesn't mean it's a complex multifactorial problem and that somebody didn't kill those people. You acquit that person, and then you go out and you do your research better and your investigation better, and you find the right suspect, and it still might be just one guy or one woman. So, but we hear today, one of the phrases that drives me crazy is, obesity is a multifactorial complex problem, or diabetes is a multifactorial complex problem. What researchers mean by this is you can't blame me for failing to solve this because it's just so tough. It's not physics. It's not easy. You don't have elementary particles. And it's like, well, maybe you just shouldn't have locked on to these ideas so early so that I just read a paper today, as we were getting on the air, researchers studying the effect of high-fat diets and feeding twice as many calories as someone needs to their subjects to see how they respond and how that associates with their weight gain later on in life. And the reason they're feeding them high-fat diets and twice as many calories is because they feel the reason those people got fat to begin with is they ate fat and they ate too much. So their belief system infects the research they do, and then they've only tested one hypothesis, so they can only follow that hypothesis. Everything's infected by these beliefs. And in fact, it's funny, when I wrote my books, like the Diet Delusion, I was speaking to people like you. So not just like intelligent people outside of nutrition who could begin to put together, does this make sense? And in the book, I say, as you're reading it, ask yourself the question, does this make sense?
Yeah.
There's an old line about Hollywood. Can I swear on this show?
Yeah, mildly.
Okay, the joke is...
I can already edit it out if it's too much.
Okay, I spent 10 years living in Los Angeles. My wife grew up in Hollywood. She was a Hollywood family. The joke in Hollywood is, how do you say fuck you in Hollywood? And the answer is, trust me. And so the last thing you ever want to do as a journalist writing about this, or research writing about this, is imply that you should trust me about what you know. It's like, you get, and this is actually true in science too. It's you give them the data, you explain all the reasons why you could be wrong. You're brutally honest about the pros, the cons. You give them the references so they could go track it down for themselves and see whether you got the references right.
And does it, I mean, you mentioned something about a court case then, which is quite interesting. You have a retrial if the new evidence comes to light. Does it frustrate you as an investigative journalist that you uncover all the new evidence? They've villainized the wrong subject, and yet you can't get the court to change their decision.
Yes, it does. That's a sort of whistleblower phenomena. Whistleblowers in fraud or misconduct cases in industry or science or the Defense Department, these are not people who have uncovered malfeasance among their colleagues and had it taken seriously. Because if it's taken seriously, so you notice that somebody's and you work with is cooking the books, and you tell your boss, and your boss tells his boss, and they have an investigation that somebody gets fired and the books get fixed, there's no whistleblower necessary because the system did what it did. People like me and others are those that we say, look, the classic story, the emperor's new clothes, we're the kids saying, look, the emperor's naked. Guys, the emperor's he's buck naked. You're telling him he's dressed and he's walking down the street with everything hanging out. Nobody's listening to us.
Yeah.
But we do get, I said, you find out that people are, it just takes a while. And this is true of all science. And it just takes, 20 or 30 years. The scientists themselves, from their perspective, I'm not trained in what they do. I don't have a PhD in nutrition or obesity research or endocrine. I'm a lousy journalist. And while they respect journalists because they read them in the newspapers and they know they're very good investigative journalists out there with Pulitzers and things like that, those people are not working in their field. So I'm a guy who comes along and says, look, I've looked into what you do, and I've concluded that you're wrong. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. About 10 years ago, I gave a talk at the largest academic obesity research center in the U.S. called the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. It's in Louisiana. And I give this talk explaining why this idea that we get fat because we eat too much is absurd, and clearly obesity is an a hormonal regulatory problem. And at the end of the talk, one of the faculty of this research institute raises his hand. He's kind of an elegant guy in his mid-60s, gray hair, beard. And he says, excuse me, Mr. Taubes, is it fair to say that one subtext of your talk is that you think we're all idiots? And one subtext of my talk is clearly that they screwed up, right? That they spent their whole lives being dedicated research scientists, and they screwed up on a scale that's almost too big to imagine. And so, you could, short form terminology would be to say, I think they're idiots. I couldn't say that. I still can't say it. I get in trouble every time I say something like this on a podcast. People say Taubes is saying all the scientists are idiots. But if I'm right and they're wrong, that's the implication. They screwed up. I was somehow smarter than they are. It's impossible for any of us to think that way.
Yeah, and
accept that kind of criticism and that kind of implication.
But you have to strip some of this back to basics, don't you? We had Patrick Holford on recently, a brilliant doctor in the UK, written 40 books, phenomenal guy. And he's, in fact, if you track through his books over 30 years, he's changed his opinion a little bit. He was very much into a low-carb diet, but not a no-carb, but very much as long as it was a low on the GL scale, it was absolutely fine. And even Patrick has changed his views a little bit. And he said to me the other day, he said, Steve, sometimes you just, and this is a Linus Pauling phrase, he said, sometimes you just have to follow the logic and not follow the money. And it seems that so many people and so much science seems to be influenced by following the money because they're trying to, they're being funded by either the pharmaceutical or the food companies for the research. They only then get famous if that research gets published, and it only gets published if they think people are going to read it. And they get so wedded to their own hypotheses that...
But it's not just, it's classic groupthink. So groupthink, I mean, you think about it, like we work with these researchers at Columbia University, we being this not-for-profit I founded, which funded some of their research. And we were hoping to test this energy balance idea, and it became a fiasco. But these guys, they're very well respected. So they believe that obesity is caused by eating too much, which I think is like believing that wealth is caused by making too much money, just meaningless hypothesis. But they've believed this, and they've always believed it, and they've gotten to the point they're at the top of their field. All these very smart, accomplished people think just like they do and believe that they're very good at what they do. So they get an enormous amount of positive feedback. It's like they go to the Church of Energy Balance, and the Church of and their priests in the Church of Energy Balance, and everybody in that church around the world respects them for what they do. And that's what they see, and that's the feedback they've got. And if they want to do better at getting that respect, they promote that idea even further. They do research that supports that idea. It all feeds back without even any money being involved. The money is involved in funding. But, and if you were to ask them to pick 10 people whose intelligence they respected, they would all be 10 people who agree with them.
Sure.
Like you think I'm smart because we agree now.
Yeah.
If we didn't agree, you wouldn't think I was so smart.
It's not just we agree. I read your books and I lost my weight. So that for me, okay, anecdotal, one person, the evidence is there, and everybody I've met that's overweight that follows it. I've not yet met somebody that hasn't followed the advice, hasn't yet lost weight. And some people I know there's a great website in the UK that I'm doing some work with, diabetes.co.uk. 70,000 people on our little island have let me retract that, have put into remission their diabetes. The evidence is there.
No, I know, but they have, for everything we say, they have a belief system that allows them to see that evidence and interpret it differently. So those 70,000 people, for instance, lost weight. So they'll say the reason they lost weight is they ate less. Not that they ate fewer carbs or high fat or this diet or that diet, but they ate less, and the reason their diabetes went into remission is because they lost weight. So these different worldviews have different ways to interpret the evidence. This is a classic, phenomenon science. This Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions sort of talked about this problem and described it. But for those people, it's easy for you to switch because you're not in that world. You don't go to that church.
Yeah.
You may have believed what they believe, but you don't go to the church every day.
Yeah.
For them, they go to the church every day. They're living in the church. They are officers in the church. If they change how they think, they become outsiders. They become, iconoclasts. They're excommunicated. Now they're us. Now they're floating around in the wilderness telling people, look, it's the carbs, dude. It's not. Now they're, it's hard to give all that up.
Yeah.
And even when you start, it's funny, when I give lectures on this, I've given grand rounds in medical school, I feel like the half-life, to use a scientific term, is 36 hours. So these researchers and doctors will hear me talk, and they'll think, hey, he's a smart guy. I never really thought of it that way. That's really interesting. I've crafted the talk to, with the history. So they kind of everything in the talk is crafted to get them to relax their defenses and let me get to their belief system, and then to explain why their belief system is wrong and replace it with a different belief system. And by the end, they're really, by the end of the lecture, 90% of the doctors will be thinking, this is really interesting. I never thought of it this way. And then within 36 hours, half of them have collapsed back to the way they thought all along because it was just easier.
Yeah.
And they didn't have to keep thinking and struggling. And another half, 36 hours later, and after about a week, there's maybe one guy left who was overweight and struggles with his weight, who's now eating a low-carb diet to see if it works. And if he does it right, it'll work, and then we'll get that guy. Out of 100 in the audience, 3 months from now, there'll be one person who believes, but he'll keep his mouth shut because he doesn't want to be excommunicated.
Yeah, it's fascinating yet frightening at the same time, isn't it? Yeah. It's fascinating, it's frightening, it makes you furious. I'm sure I have not met anybody yet who hasn't got family or friends that have been diagnosed with some illness that we know is probably related to the wrong food advice. So, it's saddening that it's cutting life short. Right, let's change topic. Tell me a little bit about your new book that you're writing. What sort of theme, what topic's the next one?
Well, same theme, same topics. Again, I'm trying to get people to understand where we made the mistakes, how we made the mistakes, and how to fix it. So I also interviewed over 100 physicians around the world who have bought into our way of thinking. About 140 folks total with, sorry, can you hear that beeping?
That's fine, don't worry.
Okay. Just to understand the challenges to the physicians and the challenges to their patients in embracing this sort of low-carb, high-fat eating or ketogenic eating. Keto is the code word in the U.S., the fad word. So the book, I think in the UK as of yesterday, is going to be called The Case Against Carbs. In the US, it's going to be called The Case for Keto, because we talk about keto more here than you guys do. And subtitle, I hope, will be Rethinking Weight Control and the Art and Science of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating, because that's what I'm trying to communicate. And I wanted to sort of write a book that would, again, that if you're thinking about this, if you're on the fence, if you're hearing about it from your friends, or you know that your neighbor down the street, or your physician who knows a doctor who's now treating people, I wanted to write a book that would easily introduce people to the subject and the logic and the arguments, and then help them, if they decide to try this. Because one of the arguments is, we grew up believing if you eat a lot of fat, like if you have eggs and bacon for breakfast, it's going to kill you, right? It's just the eggs are going to clog your artery. The bacon's going to give you, I don't know, colon cancer or something, and you're going to drop dead within a week. I mean, it's very few of us 20 years ago could eat eggs and bacon for breakfast and not feel that we were doing something harmful. I mean, it's interesting. You'd have a cigarette after your eggs for bacon, and that would be relatively benign compared to the eggs and bacon. I want people to understand what the science really shows. I want them to know that that they can experiment and try it for themselves, because if you have something to gain, and many of us do, if you're overweight, obese, if you've been fighting your weight your whole life, this is the biological approach to fixing it. So that's what I'm, as opposed to this idea that we're somehow physics machines and we should just force ourselves to eat less and exercise more and that'll solve everything. I always have this vision of like greyhounds, thinking if they could just get those basset hounds to run around the track, they could turn the basset hounds into greyhounds. And they'll be fast and light on their feet, and they'll be slender. And, what they do is they finally we've instituted government programs to get those basset hounds out on the track. And what you end up with is emaciated, exhausted basset hounds who are so hungry that when they're done running, they're going to eat so much and so many carbs, they're even going to get fatter than they were to begin with. So these are the things I'm trying to sort of get people to rethink. And again, it's the message and the research is based on the earlier books, plus these, very, very smart physicians around the world informing me on how they think about it.
Great.
It should be out in April, I think.
Well, we'll make sure we put links everywhere to it and promote it for you. One question, you said a moment ago that you were personally predisposed to putting on weight and gaining weight. And was this before all your research? And then obviously, did you then sort of listen to all the things that you'd uncovered and then start going sort of keto yourself, or?
Yeah, I was always, I was a chubby kid, not obese, just chubby. I have a brother who was very lean and I was thicker, and we both ate as much as humanly possible because we were kids. And he grew up to be a rower and a runner, and I grew up to play American football. And in American football, like rugby, you kind of want to be as big as humanly possible. So by my senior year, I was in college. I was 6'2". I weighed about 240 pounds.
Wow.
And when I got out of college, I lost that weight and I got down to what's healthy for me, which is around 210. It's at about 95, 98 kilos, something like that. And then as I got older, as I went through my 30s, I started gaining about 2 pounds a year. I was living in Los Angeles. I was eating a mostly plant, very healthy diet, exactly what we were supposed to be doing. I was shunning fat as though it was the plague. I used to joke that in my LA years, I probably boiled 10,000 eggs and threw out 10,000 yolks and only ate the whites. That's not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
Anyway, when I started my research, I actually had an economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I was doing 2 stories simultaneously. I was doing this investigation for the journal Science on dietary fat, and I was writing a story for another science magazine on the mathematics of the stock market. So I was interviewing this economist at MIT. And I started telling him, we started talking about the fat story, and he said, oh, if you're studying dietary fat, you got to try Atkins. He said he has a collaborator at the Wharton Business School, which is famous now for being the school that our beloved President Trump graduated from. He had a professor, a collaborator at Wharton, whose father lost 200 pounds on Atkins. And he said he lost 40 pounds and basically gave up white rice. He's an Asian American. And I should do it as an experiment. So at the time, this was 1999, 2000. I went back to Los Angeles where I was living. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. I could eat my eggs and bacon. And if I had a heart attack, nobody would really care. My parents had passed on. So I tried Atkins as an experiment. So it's, eggs and bacon for breakfast and eggs, bacon, and sausage. Lunch would usually be something like half a roast chicken with green salad or green vegetables, or a steak with green salad and green vegetables, and dinner would be the same. And I lost 25 pounds effortlessly. It was bizarre. In LA, you tend to exercise a lot. They don't have cafes and the like, and you have to drive to them, so you just exercise instead of. So I was working out an hour a day trying to keep my weight under control. And suddenly I'm losing weight effortlessly without working out at all. I even stopped working out for a while because it seemed kind of superfluous. And I seemed to be eating a lot of food. It used to be if I wanted to lose weight, I had to cut portions and I was hungry all the time. Here I was eating enormous portions. Like when I say eggs and bacon and sausage, I mean 5 eggs and 5 strips of bacon and 3 pieces of sausage. It just seemed to me like an enormous amount of food. And it was so fascinating. I actually fell off the diet. And then about 1.5 years later, when I was doing this infamous New York Times Magazine article, I went back on it, and I've stayed on it ever since. And, I find it's just very easy for me to maintain a healthy weight, and I appear to be very healthy.
Well, you certainly look it. For somebody that's just come off a plane from Israel, which is half the way around the world from California, and probably an intense conference, you look fantastic. And for those that don't know about that infamous article, we'll make it the last question and let you go and get some sleep. For those that don't know this infamous article, tell us all about it.
So I had pitched to the Times Magazine a story on what caused the obesity epidemic. This is fall of 2001. And as I'm doing the research, I begin to learn about all the stuff we've been talking about today, and I end up writing a piece that was sort of seen as an apology for the Atkins diet. The gist of it was, if anyone had gotten nutrition right over the past 50 years, it might have been Atkins, who'd been pilloried by the medical establishment and was universally perceived as a quack, except suddenly I write a New York Times Magazine article arguing the opposite. So the cover headline, there was a picture on the cover of a particularly greasy looking porterhouse steak with a pat of butter on it. And I forget, there are 2. There's a cover headline and the headline over the article. One of them was, what if it's all been a big fat lie? And the other is, what if fat doesn't make you fat? And this was easily the most controversial article they had published in a decade. I mean, it was like, the world went crazy. And I knew it would be controversial. I had no idea how crazy it would get for me personally, and for it's just, And then like I said, the response from the community was swift, and not just researchers, but journalists. I had friends in the journalism community who had written books about obesity and had parroted the conventional wisdom, what they were told by the researchers. That's what journalists see their job as. So for me to come along and say, oh no, don't listen to those guys, listen to these 4 people over here, they probably know the truth. Yeah, even for my journalist friends, it was hard, and for some of them, it's still hard. They still think I somehow went crazy on July 7, 2002 and never recovered.
Yeah, amazing. Well done for yourself and Tim Noakes for, standing up against everybody and telling what we are all convinced is the truth. And if anybody wants to follow you, Gary, just tell them your website. Is it Gary?
Well, I have a website, GaryTaubes.com, GaryTaubes, and I don't blog as much as I should, which means I blog about once a year. But nowadays, I guess you have to do podcasts, so blogging is passé anyway. I tweet. I'm on Twitter at Gary Taubes, and I've got the book coming out in April, and my old books are worth reading. So
without
I think so.
Yeah, in my new book, which is called Fat and Furious, which talks about my life being fat and why I was furious, I'm putting all the, we've got 21 people like yourself that we've talked to, Robert Lustig, Tim Noakes, Asim Malhotra, and so on, and we're putting links to all the contributors down the bottom. So we'll put all those in. I'll probably drop you an email to make sure we know the exact name of the title for the UK, and we'll give it a good plug. The last 2 questions I ask every journalist, every scientist, every doctor, 2 questions. First one is, give me your 3 or 4, we've already covered them really, I guess, but your 3 or 4 things, if you were giving advice to your children or your relatives, what should we be doing to live healthier for longer?
Well, if it's my children, I'm starting with sit properly. Put the screens down, walk away from the Nintendo and the Xbox. And, no, again, it's, avoid sugar and sugary beverages. Probably artificial sweeteners. If you get rid of your sweet tooth, it's not necessary to enjoy life or food. And I say that having been an ex-smoker. If you are lean and healthy, you can eat whole foods, and that'll probably keep you lean and healthy. So not refined grains. And if you're not lean and healthy, and then you want to abstain from carbs. The way Briat-Savran put it in 1825 was more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrates, and I think that's what we have to do for those of us who are predisposed as we are, and get a good night's sleep. If nothing else, you'll feel better.
That's brilliant. And the last one I ask everybody, sometimes gets very unexpected answers, but let's see how it goes. What would you like your legacy to be?
He didn't go crazy fighting the establishment for 30 years. He didn't get bitter. There's this famous fellow Semmelweis, who was in the late 19th century, found that if surgeons wash their hands and doctors wash their hands before they go into the obstetrics wards, they would reduce the disease rate, and women would give birth and would live much longer, and they wouldn't die in childbirth, and all these various diseases and deaths would be prevented if the doctors would just wash their damn hands and the nurses would wash their hands. And he had very significant evidence, and it took him 20 or 30 years to convince the world. And the Semmelweis is often brought up as a metaphor for people like me who are trying to convince the medical community. And I say, yeah, but the thing with Semmelweis is he died insane in a mental hospital. So I would like to avoid that fate.
It's been absolute pleasure talking to you. Wish you continued success. And again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for writing those books. It was, like I say, one of the very first ones that I read that turned my health around. And we will make sure we plug your books. And again, thank you for taking the time to talk straight off a flight.
Well, thank you for all of this.
You're welcome, Gary. Thank you very much.
Okay.
If you enjoyed this podcast, then why not subscribe to the full series so you can hear from all the incredible health professionals we spoke to. For the full story, you can also get the book Fat and Furious, written by Steve Bennett, available on Amazon. And to say a huge thank you for watching us here on YouTube, we are even offering you an exclusive Amazon discount code so you can get yourself a copy. For more details, head to the description below.